Hi there, I'm Anne from To Die For Art, and I'm going to talk to you today about upcycling clothes, one of my favorite things to do. So a little while ago I bought this shirt, which I really love. One of the reasons that I love it is the print. Also, it has a button in exactly the right place. Anytime you buy a shirt and you wonder why it isn't quite fitting right, why it keeps gaping up at the front, if there isn't a button right at the widest point of your bust, you're going to have problems with it all along. So this shirt fit great as far as that's concerned, but it was a little bit snug. So I went and bought a men's shirt, cut off the sleeves, and did an insert to make it fit me a little bit better. Most of the extra width that I needed was in the hips, a little bit in the bust, and now the shirt fits me great. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is what I did with the rest of that other shirt. Alright, so one of the first things I had to decide was I've already removed one sleeve, and I decided that I would take out the other sleeve on this men's shirt and use it to add a ruffle and an insert in the back. So I took a look at my fabric here. I could go with this red and white toile, which is sort of a French kind of fabric, and it doesn't really work with the whole cowboy theme that's here with this, with the neat details that are already in the front. I had this other fabric, this plaid with some really bright, colorful colors as well as the red, and I thought that looks kind of fun. And then I had thought, I want to add that kind of embroidery look that they have on a lot of cowboy shirts up at the front on the yoke. So I took a look through my fabric for for a piece that had some motifs that I can cut out quite easily and put on instead of hand embroidering. I'm going to add these as little pieces. I'm going to cut them out. I'll show you exactly how to do that. So I took a look at that and I thought, wow, some of those oranges and reds really go with this fabric. So I decided that that's the one I'm going to go with. So the next thing I did was I turned the shirt over. I took a look at the back, very carefully ironed, pressed it so that I had a straight line going up the back, and I split it. Partly because I needed a little bit of extra room in the hips because men's shirts basically go down straight. And also because I kind of like the look of sort of a bustle added into the back. I've done that before with a shirt. And what I do is I cut off the sleeve and I use the pattern that's up at the top. It's the pattern shape to create this kind of extra piece that goes down the bottom. So I went ahead and I did that, and I've got to inset it, but then I thought, okay, I also want to add some kind of ruffles in here. So I'm just going to go do that, sew this in, and show you what it looks like. Hey, so I've got some fabric ready for making this ruffle, but I don't do my ruffles the way that everybody else does. I've cut a piece of fabric that's about 2.5 inches, 3 inches wide, and I've turned under the edges, and I'm going to kind of sew it together in a crazy sort of random way. I don't gather it and make it all even because I want this to be a little special, a little unconventional, not like anybody else would be wearing. So I'm going to do that on the machine in a minute and show you what it looks like. One of the reasons why I decided I should do this is that when I hemmed the sleeve, I decided to do a turned hem. I made a mistake and I had blue in my bobbin thread. So then I thought, all right, am I going to pick that out and redo it, or am I just going to start adding some extra things? So that's what I decided. I could also do this completely flat, but I think it's going to look a little more interesting with some texture going on here. And also, no matter what you do, because there's a curve, I'm going to end up having to put some sort of pleating in there. So I'm going to deliberately add a little extra and make it a little bit fun. Okay, so let's take a little look at how I do my crazy random ruffling. I don't have to worry about raw edges at the side because I'm going to catch that all in. So I'm just going to start at the top, which is a little bit narrower than the bottom because this piece is angled in. So that's going to be the narrow one. I'm going to have to do a little more gathering on this side. I've got my machine set to zigzag because I want to make sure I catch things in as I randomly pleat this thing. So let's just see what's going to happen. So I'm not worrying too much about it being perfect. Okay, I'm just kind of randomly pleating it from time to time in here. I don't want it really full. Just adding a little bit of texture and interest to the whole thing. Yeah, I'm going to pull these pleats kind of randomly. I'm going to, instead of having them go straight down, I'm going to deliberately, have them be a bit looser or a bit crumpled up. I want some sort of fun kind of texture going on here with this. Hey, so one other thing I want to show you is that on a men's shirt, it generally won't fit you in the bust. Now, strangely enough, I had to take it in, even though, well, men are a much more triangle sort of shape. So for it to fit me around the waist and hips, it's going to be really huge in the chest, even though I am quite busty, really. So I took it in about up to 2 inches at the top for about 7 to 8 inches long. I just tried it on, pinned it, and then stitched that area down. So basically taking a whole triangle out of the sides. And the other thing that I did, which you've probably noticed, but I didn't particularly point out, is I cut off all the collar, that kind of thing. I've left, I cut it off so that there would be one snap not too far from the top. And I'm going to put fabric around there. I'm going to do a casing, fabric casing, and put elastic in it. And gather it slightly. So again, we're going to take a look at all that when I'm finished sewing. So I took another look at this top and decided that I didn't really like the sleeve on it after all, and that I was just going to put a binding on it instead. So I've done that around the neck and one of the sleeves, and I'm just going to show you what my method is for doing that. Okay, so here we are with the wrong side of the garment. We can see the seam allowance there, so we know we're in the right place. The right side of the bias binding, which you can't really tell because this fabric doesn't have a right or wrong side. And I'm going to fold back a little piece so that I can get, it has a neat finish. For one thing, you don't want any raw edges. And I'm going to be able to slide the elastic in really, really easily. Now, one of the things you want to remember is to stop with your needle down. And if you've got one of those great machines that just lets you push a button and it will always do that, that's fantastic. But otherwise, you want to stop with the needle down before you sort of rearrange your fabric and your binding. Because this binding is not cut on the bias, it doesn't really curve the way that bias binding does. But since it's going to be an elastic going through it and it's going to be gathered up anyway, it doesn't really matter, and it takes a lot less fabric, and it's actually quite easy to work with. Bias binding, you have to be careful not to stretch it. So here we go, sewing away. Now I've come to the point where my bias binding my binding is going to meet the other piece. I have it start and stop at the underarm so that it's not really out of, obvious if it isn't exactly perfect. I'm going to cut off the extra now. I don't do that ahead of time because I find that things often stretch a little when you're sewing them, and you don't want to end up having it just a little too big or a little too long. I'm just going to fold it back. Now you see my needle is already down, so I can lift the presser foot up without losing my place. I'm going to turn that under and sew it down. And I'm just going to back stitch a little, lift my needle up before I lift my presser foot, otherwise all sorts of weird things happen with your bobbin thread, and snip this off. Okay, so I've turned my garment so the right side is on the inside, and I find that makes it a lot easier to do this final stitching. So I've pressed under 1/4 inch all the way around, and the edges are pressed, and now I'm going to go and stitch it. So the nice thing is that when I go to stitch this, the first line of stitching is going to be covered up by the fold. All you're going to see is the top stitching. that where you end up having an extra line is going to be on the inside of the garment. You'll see what I mean in just a sec. All right. So all of the stitching, the really nice stitching, is on the outside here. I don't know if you can see. I can stitch this really nicely along. It's on the outside. On the inside, I stitched it first, and then of course the stitching, the second layer of stitching that I've put in is not necessarily going to meet up exactly rightly. If you had sewn it to the right side first, then you've got to worry about that, or you've got to hand stitch it all. Now the other thing is that because I folded under those two edges, I can now slip the elastic through the casing and really easily gather my armhole. So to make the false embroidery on this top, I'm using a piece of cotton that has some motifs that I think I can cut out fairly easily. They have really sort of defined edges, and I can cut them out. I'm probably going to do some satin stitching onto the top, and possibly even a little bit of hand stitching as well. Now, I mean, if you love embroidery and you want to embroider your cowboy shirt that you've turned into a tunic, that would be great. But if you'd like to go the fast and easy route like me, you're going to want to use something like Heat and Bond or Steam-A-Seam. So this is Heat and Bond Featherlight. It works the same way as the Steam-A-Seam, except that it doesn't have that second piece of paper. So I would cut this out to the width that I want, or the shape that I want, and just take this plastic wrapping away, because it's sold like in big lengths by the meter, not in this case I'm not buying it in sort of pre-cut pieces. Turn it over and attach it, iron it lightly to the wrong side of my fabric, and then I can peel off this backing paper and attach it permanently to the garment. So I want to cover the whole thing with the web so that it's going to be, the edges are sealed when I cut them out, and also I'm not sure what motifs I'm going to need, so I'm just going to go to it, cover the whole thing. So in this case I'm going to use a pencil just to mark basically the line that I want to cut it along, and then I'm going to cut it out and attach it. Okay, so I'm going to press the paper side down, no steam, at medium heat for 2 seconds, so it's very quick. And this is just the first side that I'm trying to press down, so I'm just getting it basically tacked on. So you let the Heat and Bond cool, and then you're going to just peel it right off. And you have to make sure that the plastic is left behind. It's actually quite shiny on the fabric, and you'll be able to feel it, that it feels a bit like plastic. So you can peel it away, and then I'm going to, from the right side, I'm going to cut out my motifs and start placing them. Alright, a couple of quick little tips on stitching this to my garment. I did a couple of test pieces and found that satin stitch really didn't look very good. Tried straight stitch and the same thing. So I've gone with a zigzag that's fairly narrow and a fairly short stitch length, but it's definitely not a satin stitch. Here's a piece that I've already attached. The reason I went with that too is this fabric is fairly lightweight, and it didn't seem to like having some satin stitch put on it. Okay, so one of the things is you want to make sure that you end with your needle down whenever you're doing zigzag, and there we go. There we go. So now I can move it a little bit as I go. And of course my machine did not end down. And here's the thing that's a little bit of a trick, and it took me a while to learn it, which is you have to decide which side of the zigzag your needle should be down when you're going to turn your fabric. So I've turned it down on the left. I'm going to lift up my presser foot, and I'm going to turn my fabric to the left. And when I do this, it doesn't, whoops. When I do this, it won't leave a big gap. There we go. It wasn't the right place. Okay, so when I turn it left, I want my needle on the left side. I turn my fabric to the left. And then you get a really nice, neat zigzag. So now I'm going to turn it. It ended on the right side. I turn the fabric to the right. And you just have to always stop and think about that a little bit before you turn. So turn to the left, turn to the left. So I end with my needle down to the left because I'm going to turn my fabric to the left. I'm going to end with my needle on the right side of the zigzag because I turned the fabric to the right side. Now I just want to point out that I didn't try and use the exact same motifs on both sides of my top because there weren't exact reverse images of them. So no matter what I did, I wasn't going to be able to make it exactly reverse each other, which is what you see commonly in sort of Western wear. So what I did was I deliberately made them different, but covered about the same amount of space as, you know, on each side, and used about, you know, had it end and start in about the same place on the garment on each side. But it's better to deliberately make it not match than try and make it and not quite do it, because then it just looks like a mistake. So again, on the back, you'll see I didn't try and match up the motifs. I have the largest in the center, but sort of on an angle. And then I just kind of went, you know, off into a wonderful play with all these different things, and used about, you know, had it begin and end at about the same place on the garment on each side, but didn't try and make it symmetrical because it wasn't going to be in any case. So this is the very first his shirt into her tunic, terrific tunic that I've made. Took the collar off, took the sleeves off, put in some casing, put one of the sleeves into a bustle at the back, added some texture and fun, used part of the cuff to put an accent on, and of course added the kind of faux embroidery that has that real cowboy look. So have some fun, make one for yourself, put your cowboy on.